I want to start this video off by saying please consider liking and subscribing. It really helps out the channel. And with that, back to the story. I work night security at a hospital. I really wish the crying children on my floor were just ghosts. A month ago, I was desperate for work. I applied for a job with a private security firm. The hiring process was surprisingly fast. I filled out a basic application online, and the next day, a man in a dark gray suit interviewed me. He did not ask about my previous experience. He only asked if I had a family in the area, or if I had a girlfriend, and if I was comfortably working alone at night. I told him I lived completely alone and needed the money. He smiled, handed me a uniform, and told me I was hired. They assigned me to a massive sprawling hospital complex. It is a huge facility with multiple wings and separate buildings connected by elevated walkways. My assignment was very specific. I was assigned to guard the fourth floor of the East Wing. The East Wing is an older section of the hospital. The first floor has been entirely shut down. When I stepped out the elevator my first night, I saw that the entire double door entrance to the floor was sealed off. It was covered in thick, heavy, milky white plastic sheeting. The edges were taped completely to the walls, floor, and ceiling with heavy silver duct tape. Across the center of the plastic, wide strips of red warning tape were crossed in an X. The tape had bold black letters printed on it, and it read, "Caution, asbestos abatement in progress. Authorized personnel only. Strict biohazard protocols apply." My job was to sit at a small folding desk positioned directly in front of this plastic barrier. I was scheduled from midnight until 8 in the morning. The supervisor told me my only responsibility was to make sure nobody tampered with the plastic and nobody tried to enter the floor. He said the chemicals and dust inside were highly toxic and told me to stay in my chair, to do my hourly radio checks, and keep people away. For the first week, it was the most boring job I have ever had. The hallway was completely empty. The overhead fluorescent lights hummed constantly. I brought a book and read it cover to cover. Once an hour, I pressed the button on my radio, said my unit number, and reported that the fourth floor was secure. The dispatch would acknowledge, and then silence would return. I liked the quiet, and I needed a paycheck, so I did not ask questions. Then the sound started. It happened during my second week, around 3 in the morning. I was sitting at my desk, fighting to keep my eyes open. The hospital was completely silent. Then I heard a noise come from the other side of the heavy plastic sheeting. It was a sharp, rhythmic sound. It sounded exactly like a rusty wheel turning on hard tile floor. It would squeak, pause, and squeak again. I recognized the sound immediately. When I was a teenager, I spent a few weeks in a hospital recovering from a bad accident. I knew the sound of an IV pole being dragged across the floor. I sat up straight in my chair. I looked at the milky plastic. I could not see through it. It was too thick, and the lights on the other side were off. I stood up and walked close to the barrier. I listened. The squeaking sound moved slowly down the hidden hallway and then stopped. A few seconds later, I heard crying. It was incredibly muffled by the thick plastic, but it was unmistakable. It was a soft, exhausted, broken sobbing of a small child. It sounded like a child who had been crying for hours and had no energy left. I stood there frozen. My heart started beating faster. I did not know what to do. The signs clearly said the area was a toxic hazard zone. There was no reason for a child to be in there. I leaned my face close to the plastic. "Hello?" I said, my voice echoed in the empty hallway. "Is someone in there?" The crying stopped instantly. The squeaking wheel did not return, and the floor went completely silent. I sat back down at my desk. I tried to rationalize it. I told myself that sound travels in weird ways through large buildings. The hospital has air vents and elevator shafts. The crying probably came from the maternity ward on the second floor, traveling up the pipes. I convinced myself I was just tired and hearing things. But the next night it happened again. This time it was not just sounds. It was shortly after 2 in the morning. I was drinking a cup of coffee. I heard a soft rustling sound. It sounded like a hand rubbing against the inside of the plastic sheeting. I looked up. The hallway light above my desk had a slight glare on the plastic, but from the other side, pushing against the milky surface, I saw a shadow. It was small and was the height of a 7-year-old child. The shadow stood directly in front of the double doors. Then two small hands pressed against the plastic. I saw the distinct outline of small fingers pushing the material outward. The plastic bowed slightly towards me under the pressure. I dropped my coffee cup. It spilled all over the floor, but I did not care. I watched as another small shadow joined the first one, then a third. They were pressing their hands against the barrier. They did not speak or even bang on the doors. They just pressed their hands against the plastic, standing in the dark. I backed away from my desk. My hands were shaking. I reached for my radio, but I stopped. What was I gonna report? The children were the asbestos zone? I'm not a brave person, but I'm also not a skeptic. I know that hospitals are places where a lot of people pass away. I know that old buildings hold on to things. I stared at the small shadows in my mind, jumping to the most logical conclusion a terrifying person could reach. The floor was haunted. I assumed the fourth floor used to be the pediatric wing. I assumed that children who had died there decades ago were trapped in the space, repeating their final days, pushing their IV poles through the dark. It made sense to me. It explained the sounds, the shadows, and it explained why the floor was completely sealed off. Maybe the asbestos warning was just a cover story to keep people away from a haunted section of the hospital. I just stood against the far wall of the hallway and watched. After a few minutes, the small hands withdrew. The plastic smoothed out, and the shadows faded away into the dark. When my shift ended at 8 in the morning, I was exhausted. The morning guard arrived to relieve me. I handed them the radio and walked to the elevators. I went down to the ground floor. There's a small cafeteria near the main lobby where the hospital staff gets coffee before their shift begins. I bought a black coffee and sat at a small table in the corner. A few minutes later, an older woman in a light blue scrub sat down at the table next to me. She had a badge that identified her as a head nurse. She looked incredibly tired. She was staring blankly at her coffee cup. I decided to ask her. I needed to know if my theory was correct. "Excuse me," I said quietly. She looked up at me. She noticed my security uniform. Her expression tightened slightly. "Yes?" she asked. "I work the night shift," I said. "I'm assigned to the fourth floor of the east wing, the one sealed off for asbestos." The moment I mentioned the fourth floor, all the color drained from her face. Her eyes darted across the cafeteria, checking to see if anyone was sitting near us. She gripped her coffee cup tightly. "What about it?" she asked. Her voice was suddenly very defensive. "I was just wondering," I said, trying to sound casual. "Was that floor used for pediatrics in the past? Did it used to be the children's ward?" The head nurse stared at me. Her breathing became shallow. She looked genuinely terrified. Then she leaned across the small space between our tables. "Listen to me very carefully," she whispered. Her voice was shaking, but her tone was incredibly harsh. "You get paid to sit in a chair. You do not get paid to ask questions." I was taken aback. "I just saw some things, and I heard—" "I don't care what you heard," she interrupted, cutting me off completely. She leaned closer. Her eyes were wider with fear. "Do your job. Look the other way. If you want to keep breathing, you will never ask anyone about that floor again. Forget the children. Forget you ever heard anything." She stood up abruptly, leaving her coffee untouched, and walked rapidly out of the cafeteria. I sat there alone, feeling a cold knot form in my stomach. Her reaction was not the reaction of someone talking about ghost stories. I went home to my apartment, locked the door, and tried to sleep. I tossed and turned for hours. I kept thinking about the small hands pressing against the plastic, and kept hearing the tired, exhausted sobbing. I went back to work that night, arrived at midnight, took the radio from the evening guard, and sat at my desk. The hallway was quiet. The fluorescent lights hummed. I stared at the milky plastic sheeting. At 1 in the morning, I decided to walk the perimeter. The plastic barrier covered a wide set of double doors and extended a few feet down the adjacent wall. I took my flashlight and inspected the edges where the heavy silver duct tape met the wall tiles. Down near the floor, in the bottom right corner, I noticed something wrong. The tape had begun to peel away from the wall. There was a small gap. The plastic was torn slightly, creating an opening just large enough to slide a hand through. I knelt on the floor to inspect the tear. I assumed the plastic had just stretched and ripped from the tension. I planned to get a roll of tape from the supply closet and patch it. I shined my flashlight at the base of the tear. Laying on the floor tile, just outside the plastic barrier, was a small object. I reached out and picked it up. It was a lollipop. It was cherry flavored. The wrapper was twisted tightly around the base of the white paper stick. I looked at it closely in the beam of my flashlight. The top half of the red candy was missing. It had been eaten. I touched the remaining candy with my thumb. It was sticky, so it was fresh. The white paper stick was still damp with saliva. A heavy, suffocating weight of dread crashed over me. My entire theory about the floor being haunted collapsed instantly. Ghosts certainly do not eat candy, and surely won't leave it here. My mind raced. I thought about the head nurse, and the strict orders to never look behind the plastic, and about the sobbing. I stood up, and I put the lollipop in my pocket, then looked at the heavy plastic sheeting. I made a decision. It was the worst decision of my life, but I could not just sit in the chair anymore. I grabbed the edge of the torn plastic where the tape had peeled. I pulled hard, and the duct tape ripped away from the wall with a loud tearing sound. I pulled, until the gap was wide enough for me to fit through. I took a deep breath and squeezed through the opening and stepped onto the fourth floor. I immediately noticed the air. It did not smell like dust, mold, or construction debris. There was no asbestos. The air was freezing cold, and it smelled intensely of bleach, surgical iodine, and sterile alcohol. It was the sharp, biting smell of a complete sanitized environment. I turned on my flashlight and shined the beam down the hallway. The walls were not gutted, and the ceiling tiles were perfectly intact. The floor was covered in seamless, high-polished white linoleum. It was spotless. I walked slowly down the corridor, my boots making no sound on the smooth floor. I passed the first set of rooms. The doors had small glass windows. I looked inside. The rooms had been entirely retrofitted. The standard hospital beds were gone. In the center of each room was a highly advanced stainless steel surgical table. Above the tables hung massive, multi-bulb surgical legs. Along the walls were complex heart monitors, ventilators, and rolling metal trays covered in neatly organized, sterilized surgical instruments. There was a row of them, 10, maybe 12 identical surgical rooms, perfectly maintained, completely hidden behind the fake construction barrier. I kept walking down the main corridor. The hallway curved to the left. I turned the corner, and at the end of the hallway was a large open space, like a waiting area. Then I heard a sound. It was a wet, heavy, dragging sound. It sounded like a massive piece of raw meat being pulled across the polished linoleum floor. Frozen, aimed my flashlight down the corridor towards the open space. Something moved into the beam of my light. At first glance, I thought it was a huge person, but then my eyes managed to see it clearly. It was a mound of flesh. It was huge, easily the size of a small car, completely blocking the hallway. It was a gelatinous, shifting mass of skin, muscle, and hair. As my flashlight hit it, I realized with absolute horror what the mass was made of. It was covered in batches of skin of completely different colors and textures. Thick black stitches held sections of flesh together in a chaotic, haphazard pattern. Protruding from the sides of the mount were random limbs, small arms and legs bending at impossible angles, pushing against the floor to drag the massive bulk forward. But the most horrifying part was the surface of the mass. Embedded in the gelatinous flesh were faces. They were the faces of children, small, pale faces fused directly into the moving mound of tissue. Their eyes were open, blinking blindly in the beam of my flashlight, their small mouths open and closed, gasping for air that their shared monstrous lungs could barely process. Some of the faces were weeping thick, clear fluid. Some were locked in expressions of permanent, silent agony. The monster dragged itself forward, using a cluster of small, mismatched arms. It noticed the light. The entire mass shifted. The faces turned toward me. A low, unified, gurgling moan echoed down the hallway. Then the limbs scrambled against the floor with terrifying speed, propelling the heavy mound of flesh directly towards me. I panicked and dropped my flashlight. I turned around and sprinted back the way I came. The wet, slapping sound of the limbs hitting the floor echoed wildly behind me. It was fast. It was much faster than it had any right to be. I could hear the wet breathing of the faces. The gurgling moans kept getting closer to my back. I realized I was not going to make it back to the plastic barrier. The hallway was too long, and the thing was closing the distance quickly. I looked at the doors on either side of the corridor. The surgical rooms had large glass windows. If I hid in there, it would see me. I saw a solid wooden door halfway down the hallway. A small plaque next to it read "Supply Closet." I grabbed the handle and twisted it, and threw the door open. I practically dove inside. The closet was small and filled with stacks of clean linens and boxes of latex gloves. I pulled the heavy wooden door shut, but I did not close it completely. I left it cracked open just a fraction of an inch. I needed to see when the hallway was clear. Then I held the handle tightly, holding my breath, pressing my face close to the narrow gap. The wet slapping sounds grew deafening. The monstrous mass of flesh slithered past the supply closet door. I saw the faces as they passed. I saw a small boy with blonde hair, his cheeks fusing the shoulder of a little girl with dark skin. I saw an eye blinking wildly, disconnected from any nose or mouth. The smell of the thing was overwhelming. It smelled of strong iodine, fresh blood, and medical waste. It dragged itself all the way down the hall, heading towards the plastic barrier where I had entered. I stood in the dark closet, my entire body shaking violently. My mind could not process the impossible horror of the creature. I waited. I planned to wait until it moved far away, then sprint for the exit. But before I could move, I heard another sound. At the far end of the ward, past the surgical rooms, a heavy mechanical chime echoed. It was the sound of an elevator arriving. I knew the layout of the hospital. The main elevator stopped at the front desk where I sat. The elevator chiming now was the heavy service freight elevator at the back of the building. It connected directly to the underground loading docks, bypassing the main hospital lobbies completely. I peered through the narrow crack in the door. The heavy metal doors of the freight elevator slid open. Bright light spilled out into the dim hallway. People walked out of the elevator. The first two men were wearing expensive tailored suits. They carried leather briefcases, and they looked like high-level corporate executives. They walked with confidence, completely unfazed by the sterile, hidden environment. Behind them walked four men in dark uniforms. I recognized the uniforms instantly. They were the same uniform I was wearing. They belonged to my security firm. Walking in the center of the guards were the man who had hired me, the supervisor with the dark gray suit. But they were not alone. The security guards were holding the hands of a group of children. There were 6 children in total. They looked to be between the ages of 5 and 10. They were wearing cheap, worn-out clothing, and they looked exhausted, malnourished, and terrified. One of the guards pulled a little boy forward roughly. The boy stumbled. He was holding a small, dirty stuffed animal, and a little girl next to him was quietly crying, wiping her eyes with the sleeve of her oversized shirt. The corporate executive stopped in the middle of the hallway. They turned and pointed towards the surgical rooms. "Prepare rooms 1 through 6, one of the executives said. "The clients are arriving in 2 hours. We need the extractions completed and the products iced before transport. We cannot afford another delay." My supervisor nodded. He gestured to the security guards. "Get them prepped, strip them, wash them, and strip them down. The surgical team and the service elevator is coming up next." The guards began to pull the crying children towards the operating theaters. One of the kids, a small girl with braided hair, tried to pull her hand away from the guard. She cried out in a language I did not recognize. The guard did not yell. He just tightened his grips on her wrists and dragged her across the linoleum floor. I stood in the dark closet, watching through the crack in the door. My hand was clamped hard over my mouth to stop myself from making a sound. The tears streamed down my face. I watched as the guards pushed the children into the operating room. Then the heavy wooden door closed before my eyes. I knew that if I stepped out of the closet, I would probably die. My body would be carved up to one of those stainless steel tables, and whatever they did not sell would be thrown into the gelatinous pile of flesh roaming the halls. I stayed in that closet. I am completely ashamed of it, but I stayed in that closet for 5 hours. I listened to the sounds, heard the surgical team arrive, the beeping of heart monitors, and the muffled, mechanical hum of the bone saws. I sat on the floor among the clean linens, surrounded by the smell of latex. I did absolutely nothing while 6 children were murdered a few yards away. Around 7 in the morning, the hallways went quiet, and I heard the heavy doors of the freight elevator open and close several times. The executives left, and the coolers were transported, as well as the surgical team departing. I waited another 30 minutes to be absolutely sure the floor was empty. I slowly pushed the closet door open, and the hallway was silent. The floor was freshly mopped, smelling sharply of bleach. There was no sign of the children, or even the monster. I walked quietly down the corridor and reached the plastic barrier. I slipped through the tear I'd made earlier, and I stood in the regular hospital hallway and looked at the heavy silver duct tape. I carefully smoothed the plastic down, pressing the tape back against the wall so the tear was hidden. Then I sat down at my folding desk. 10 minutes later, the morning guard arrived. He smiled, handed me a coffee, and asked how my night was. I told him it was quiet, then handed him the radio. I walked to the elevator, to the ground floor, and walked out of the main doors into the morning sun. I went straight to my apartment. I packed a single duffel bag with clothes, took out the cash I had hidden in a drawer, then walked to a bus station and got on the first bus leaving the state. I threw my cell phone into a drain during a rest stop in a town I didn't know the name of. I've been running for 3 days now. I know they realize I am missing. I do not show up for my next shift. My supervisor definitely checked the cameras. He knows I abandoned my post. If he inspects the plastic barrier, he will see the tear and will know I saw what is inside. I cannot stop thinking about the half-eaten lollipop. I cannot stop thinking about that little boy holding this dirty stuffed animal. I'm writing this here because I need someone to know. I need the world to know what is happening behind the plastic sheeting on the 4th floor. You're in a hospital and see a floor sealed out for asbestos abatement, and you hear the squeak of an IV pull in the middle of the night. Please do not assume it's ghosts. Ghosts do not drop candy. They are cutting them apart, and the things they leave behind are still alive.